Okay, so we're going to pick up with an unusual exploration because typically the Spanish did not spend much time in North America at all, north of Mexico. However, there was, Ponce de Leon went to Florida and Soto went across the what we call today Alabama, Mississippi. They did a pretty much a single exploration there. But the guy that was really interesting for me is Coronado. Now, if you look where the Spanish were coming from, they're coming from, from central Mexico. Down here, Mexico City is the base of their operations. And this is really the wilderness. And so what's interesting is they come across here, and Coronado is really looking for a legendary cities of gold. They call them the cities of Cibola. He doesn't find it, but he does discover a remarkable land formation, which of course is the Grand Canyon. And he does discover some native people here. So one of the purposes that the conquistadors had beyond just simply claiming land is exploring land. And so he's going to spend, as you can see here, years exploring what we would today call the Great Plains of the United States. But back then, this was brand new territory. He's exploring the interior of North America. And I have an excerpt that is in your reading, and it's about where he goes. So this is where we being people who studied history, we think he was in Kansas, and he calls it Quivira here. So he makes it all the way to Kansas. And if you know anything about Kansas, this is going to sound pretty interesting. So, the Spanish monarchs are excited to learn about new territory. They want gold particularly. And so he's writing, and you'll notice right away he says, Your Majesty. So again, he's probably writing to the monarch. And he says it's 950 leagues, as a distance of measure. And the country is the best I've seen for producing products. So immediately you should be thinking, what kind of products can you produce in Kansas? And he mentions it's the land. And he says it's very fat and black. What a cool description of land. Fat and black. Oh, we know today that places like Kansas and Nebraska are the breadbasket of the United States. This is the Great Plains. This is where the grains of corn and wheat that the United States eats. And black soil, a very rich soil, and being very well watered by rivulets and springs and rivers. I've treated the natives of this province as well as was possible. Always skeptical to hear that. Agreeably to what your majesty has commanded. So there it's pretty interesting. The King of Spain, thank you, particularly Las Casas as well, has said you can't go around killing Indians. And they have received no harm in any way from me or from those who went in my company. I remained 25 days in Kansas, because the guides who had brought me give me an account of other places beyond this. What I am sure, though, is there's not any gold. Well, he's not actually correct there. There is gold, not in Kansas, but in South Dakota, and lots of gold in California, but any other metal in all that country. So you can tell he spent some time looking for gold, not at all unusual. Cortez, when he conquered Mexico City, in his own diary, he says, I suffer from a disease, the only cure for which is gold. All right. And he says that, in this place, there's not any gold or other metal or things really to make villages. And this is an interesting point. He's mentioning that it's treeless. There's no trees in Kansas, right? And many of those do not plant anything. And again, the Great Plains Indians, we do know, were semi-nomadic and do not have any houses except of skins and sticks. And they wander around with the cows. What a cool sentence. They wander around with the cows. So what we think is he's describing Native Americans hunting buffalo, which is what they did in the Great Plains, and says, well, it's not really useful for us. So when we look at Spanish settlement, they don't settle in Kansas. They don't settle in Oklahoma. There are a handful of settlements along the Rio Grande, mostly missionaries. But what they realize, at least from the conquistador perspective, is there's not much of value here, at least for what the Spaniards want. So that's Coronado's trip. Okay. Now, at the same time that the Spanish have finally, come into North America, the French and the English start to get in on the game. The French, of course, have been delayed because of religious war for their government, and the English have had the same problem. They've had a War of the Roses, as it's called. So they've been sort of stymied a little bit by internal war, and now they're late to the game. And so England is going to have some exploration, not a lot. It's by an Italian who gets the interesting anglicized name, John Cabot. Here you see Britain, and John Cabot sails over here along the coast of what is today Canada, Newfoundland, and down to all the way to Virginia. You can see it right there. So he sails down to the Outer Banks, and then he turns back. And so this Italian Giovanni Caboto becomes John Cabot, and he's sailing for King Henry VII. This is the father of Henry VIII. He does not make a settlement. He does not set up shop here in the Americas. But that sail, that voyage, is going to give the English claim to this territory. So when, under Queen Elizabeth, English come out to settle, this is where they're going to pick, because the English have actually staked a claim here. Now, another French claim is also made here because of two explorers as well. One is an Italian explorer named Giovanni de Verrazzano. And if you're ever up in New York City, there is a huge bridge that covers the mouth of the New York Harbor, and it's called the Verrazzano Bridge and the Verrazzano Narrows. So Verrazzano comes over, and he also stakes a little claim for France here. But really, perhaps most noteworthy for our purposes is Jacques Cartier. Now, Cartier is spelled like Carter with an I in it, and Cartier is going to sail down what is called the St. Lawrence Seaway, or the Gulf of St. Lawrence, all the way down the St. Lawrence River. So what this is going to lay is the foundation for the next sort of stage of exploration. You're going to have the French in Canada. The English are going to be along the coast of North America. And, of course, the Spanish are going to be everywhere else but Brazil. So speaking of the Spanish, they are in America. And we often forget this, the future United States of America. After Ponce de Leon, they set up a permanent settlement. And this is the first permanent European settlement in the Americas. The oldest permanent settlement in the Americas, and you can visit it today. The fort's still there, and it's St. Augustine, Florida. And so it was a very valuable fort. It controlled access to the Florida coastline. And if you've ever been down that way, you know that it's really beautiful country. But this is one of the reasons why, again, so here's St. Augustine, why the English are going to be very concerned, because they're just right down the road from the Spanish, they think, when they establish their claim. So here's St. Augustine. And that brings us to perhaps the most controversial in recent years of all the conquistadors. And so his name is Juan de Anote. And, here you can see he's got one of his legs have been chopped off. And he is going to decide to, well, I'll let you read one of his quotes, and then you can figure out what he's saying. So he's writing to one of his lieutenants, one of his soldiers who are under him. He's a don, which means like a governor. And he is in the colony, the Spanish territory of New Mexico. I say Spanish territory, the Native American territory, the Pueblo area. And it says, instructions to you, Vicente de Zaldivar, of the expedition to New Mexico for the punishment of the Pueblo of Acoma for having, killed soldiers. So here it again goes back to this debate we've been talking about. The Spanish had gone into New Mexico. The Pueblo had resisted them, particularly the Pueblo resented the religious imposition. And so they fought back. And now he's sending out what we would call a punitive expedition to punish them. Since the good success of the undertaking depends on the pleasure of God, our Lord. And they mention this all the time. In other words, our God is going to liberate or help us fight the savages. In directing you to appropriate and effective methods, it is right you should seek to prevent public offenses to him. In other words, don't offend God. You take the quickest route, and at the Pueblos you find, you would treat them well and not harm them. In other words, if they submit to you, I want to make sure you did that. If God shall be so merciful as to grant us victory, you will arrest all the people, young and old, without sparing anyone. Inasmuch as we declared on them without quarter, you will punish all of fighting age as you deem best. So what was deemed best was to chop off their legs or chop off their feet. So these Spaniards went into Acoma, which is in New Mexico, and captured and seized as many of the Pueblo people as they could, and they chopped off feet of the people that surrendered and killed 800 people. So this is considered one of the most brutal events, specific events in Spanish history or in Pueblo history. And this is the guy that they tore the statue down to in New Mexico the other day. I posted a couple videos in my YouTube channel or on my YouTube page about this debate about this guy. The Spanish considered what he did a heroic act, standing against the Pueblo. But of course, from the Native American perspective, this guy is a butcher. 800 killed, including women and children. So with that, he's got it sort of the last Spanish event And that sets the stage for the most famous Pueblo uprising against the Spanish. The Pueblo don't go down easily, and so it's the son of one of the men who were hurt in the original attack. His name is Pope, and they attack every Catholic church, Spanish outpost, anything in New Mexico that the Spanish have claimed, and they drive them from New Mexico. So the Spanish basically are driven out of New Mexico, and the Pueblo and the various others, the Hopi, will maintain their presence in New Mexico. And on the grounds of where the churches have been built, they will erect their own sacred kiva. So this was a big moment of sort of resistance to being occupied. Now, one of the things that a historian wants to point out to you, it's an interesting point. He says a major consequence of the Pueblo revolt was the opportunity to seize, to acquire, to steal, if you want to call it that, hundreds of Spanish horses. The Pueblos, when they defeated the Spanish, they seized tons of Indians, which they used to trade with the Navajo and Apache and other tribes. Their horses would then from there spread across the Great Plains, and then from there to the Missouri River Valley and out to the Rocky Mountain. So the Pueblo Revolt is the same as Pope's Rebellion. They're the same event in history, and some texts give him the sort of notoriety or fame for leading it, Pope's Rebellion, but it is the same event. Okay. Now on sort of a different story, and this guy's statue right here has been also heavily targeted for controversy because some people perceive this as still a form of white occupation or colonization, but he was a very effective missionary. His order, his name is Junipero Serra. He was a Franciscan monk, and he established a whole chain of missions throughout California. This is Baja California here, up the California coast. So if you're ever out to California, you're going to notice a lot of the towns have SAN at the start of it. And while Anchorman, while Will Ferrell may not know what San Diego means, it means saint. SAN means saint, and so lots of these sans out there, and you really the influence of the Spanish missions are still there to this day. What they did was they built them about a day's travel from each one, so it would be a place to rest, to stop. They would try to convert the natives, but they're the reason why California is sort of has a Spanish influence. If it weren't for that, because there's not that many. There will be some landowners in California eventually, but mostly it's the Spanish missions. And throughout all of Latin America, the influence of the Catholic Church is profound, any major city you go into. And so here's an interesting analysis of Native Americans. And notice, by the way, that the title from this anthropologist is myth. So he's saying this is a myth. Part of the myth is that all of them had one culture. We call this the mono myth. The white man turned everything upside down. 3 elements were important: the dislodgement of Eastern tribes, which we're going to look at in the English settlement, the introduction of the horse and metal tools and firearms. The British invaders, and to a lesser degree, the French, came to colonize. They came by the thousands. They were therefore in competition with the Indians. And even though they said they were about fairness and justice, they really weren't. And it says the Spanish came to conquer, and the Indians were seen as an essential labor to the Spanish. So it's a comparative study. In other words, the Spanish did not come here to destroy and push out the Native Americans, the argument he's saying. They came here to convert them and use them as workers. Therefore, they did not seek out to exterminate them, he argues. The Spanish then did not set these populations. This was done from the East. So this historian is saying the real reason that the Native Americans were dislocated was when Eastern Indians started moving into their territory, sort of like the Goths and the Vandals when they moved into Roman territory. He's saying that really all the Spanish did here was leave the horse. And so this is an interesting perspective. Now, I would say if you read Don Juan de Anote, you're like, I don't know if he's just here to Christianize. But the point is that, if people, the historians are saying, if they would just have been subjugated and allowed to be workforce, then they wouldn't have all died, which is an interesting argument to try to make. But nonetheless, he is giving credit or blame primarily to the displacement of the Eastern Indians into their territory. And so that's kind of useful, I think, to know as well. So with that, I want to move to this last couple maps here and let you see what was really the height of the Spanish territory. So here you see New Spain, down here is New Granada. So the Spanish really do leave an imprint, and you should know that too. Today, of course, some people would say it's ironic the way natives are treated and the way Hispanics are treated. Just a couple of jokes for you. Here's Dora the Explorer. The Spanish word for explorer is exploradora. Here she's been arrested for exploring across the border. And of course, the other probably one of the most famous memes I've ever seen is these Native Americans fighting terrorism since 1492. So that concludes our Spanish study, and we'll probably not spend any more time talking about them, and we'll move on to the English tomorrow.